Well, for more on the financial implications of controversial laws, I'm joined by Maurice Schweitzer from Philadelphia. Maurice is a professor at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So far, what has the business community's response been like?
So far it's been very muted to the Alabama situation, but I think, as you already mentioned, there's precedent where we've seen behavior from businesses that have moved out of North Carolina or diminished their business in North Carolina, and calls for boycotts from Brunei that have had significant effects. And I think the Alabama legislation actually is far more extreme than what we saw in North Carolina.
Now, which sectors then usually see the most immediate impact when a state or region introduces a controversial law?
Yeah, the businesses that are most affected are those that are most sensitive to outside influence. So, for example, the Brunei boycott targeted hotels, and those are hotels where a lot of bankers, people in the media, I mean, you talked about Netflix in North Carolina. We're seeing basically the companies that have the easiest and most flexibility and the widest reach, like Netflix and hotels, that are most effective.
And we've certainly seen that social media platforms provide this opportunity for really amplifying the discussion about these laws as well as the reaction to them. How do you think these laws are going to affect the local economies and things like tourism?
Yeah, so I think you're right. So tourism is likely to be affected. And in North Carolina, for example, they lost basketball games and a lot of government travel from states like California, New York, and even cities like Seattle, Chicago have banned government travel to those cities. So they've calculated that hundreds of millions of dollars have been lost, particularly in tourism, as well as the lack of expansion and sports athletics games. So I think it's had some effect. The broader impact for most of these industries, though, has been relatively limited. So there is an effect. I think, though, the social media and the sort of tarnished image is actually a lot of the legacy of what happens with these calls for boycotts.
And we're seeing increasingly that brands are being forced to take a stand. We know that filmmaking has flourished in states, including Alabama and Georgia, since they began their film incentive programs. So what's the likelihood that some of these major projects and movie productions will be either canceled or halted?
Yeah, I would expect companies like Netflix to pull out of Alabama. I would expect other high-tech companies where you have for a lot of these high-tech companies not only customers, but their workers that care a great deal about the company's values. And so there are many companies that are sensitive to the cost of being tainted by these calls for boycotts and the very extreme legislation that Alabama has just passed.
So when you have these boycotts, you have these huge calls to action. How effective are they?
Well, I think the record is generally mixed. We see, for example, as you noted, that Brunei backed down from enforcing the law, but they didn't completely repeal it. Similarly, North Carolina basically rescinded their bathroom bill, but what they put in place is not a complete repeal. So you do see, in this case, these sort of governments walking some of it back. The general history of boycotts, however, is pretty mixed, and in general, boycotts have not been very effective.
So then how often do we see companies that initially took a stand on an issue go back once some of this controversy has died down?
That happens. I mean, but what we see is, I think, sort of a long shadow of some of these effects. So for example, Deutsche Bank didn't follow through on expansion plans. PayPal didn't follow through on expansion plans in North Carolina, and they still have not. Netflix has still not gone back in North Carolina. And so you see this sort of long legacy. It's hard for companies to change, but I expect that over time things will probably become normalized. But there is a long shadow, and we hear from North Carolina legislators is that when they travel or they go to conferences, this issue is the top thing that comes up. So it becomes sort of a constant drumbeat of issues, and sometimes the populations will vote out politicians for basically courting unnecessary controversy. And as you noted, in some industries, like in the hotel industry, tourism, there can be acute pain. And so there are some stakeholders that really care deeply about resolving this issue.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Maurice Schweitzer there of the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania.